I'm going to present on continuing colonial pressures on Alaska Native communities. Native and other indigenous communities have suffered damage due to colonialism. Many of these communities still face pressures to abandon their ancestral ways or to change them. This pressure is to assimilate into the dominant culture around them. But this type of forced assimilation is itself a form of damage. The majority culture has pushed solutions to some of the damage to these communities. However, this is simply another form of domination or colonialism. In order to be authentic, meaningful solutions must come from within the Native communities themselves. Subsistence is a crucial part of Native culture. This type of economy, however, competes with the wage economy. There are many times where regulations themselves, which might have the best intentions, conflict with subsistence living for Native communities. There's currently no protection for Native subsistence in Alaska, and indeed there are only protections for rural subsistence. This does not necessarily appeal to the needs of the Native communities. One example of this is on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. There are communities, such as Nunapachuk, that have access to coastal fisheries. However, to protect future runs of the fish, exclusion zones move upriver along with these fish. This means that upriver subsistence is affected, and the Native communities there do not have access to a very necessary food source. This fosters conflict not only between Native communities that did not historically exist, but it also fosters conflict between Native communities and the overarching majority government. Some of these regulations do have the best interests of the wildlife as their goal. And eventually a blending of cultures is going to be somewhat inevitable. Striking a balance between those cultures, however, is difficult. Searles focused on Nunavut and the cases there. In particular, the fact that many Inuit in Nunavut are focusing on maintaining traditional or real Inuit foods. This incorporates cultural beliefs about the foods themselves. For example, that particular foods give hunters the warmth that they need to hunt, or perhaps are vital to the continuing wealth and prosperity of their communities. These belief systems are an important part of their culture, and losing the subsistence that is the foundation of these belief systems would be very traumatic and damaging. The dominant economy is, of course, the wage economy, hourly work for an hourly wage. It's up to the individual in most Native communities whether or to what degree they participate in the wage economy. There are a lot of goods, including those used for subsistence, such as weaponry, that are more easily acquired through wage economy rather than being handcrafted. There has been an increase over several decades of the number of Native people participating in the wage economy. However, there has been also an increase in the amount of hours spent on participating in subsistence activities. This shows that while many Native people are certainly able to accept some of the aspects of the wage economy, they're not willing to sacrifice an important part of their culture. There are other pressures to change behaviors as well. This can come from state agencies, again, due to regulations, or even things that are supposed to benefit a Native community. Many Native communities qualify on the Dines scale as Type 1 societies, as discussed by Stransky. This means that by definition, many of these communities do not have the resources to adapt to disastrous situations, and therefore must get some aid from the state or other government institutions. This has fostered an idea among some that work in state agencies that Native communities are dependent on the state for aid and that they are incapable of providing for themselves. There is, of course, a lot of insensitivity behind that viewpoint. Many Native communities don't have the resources simply because of the size of the community, and the same would be true for a community made of any type of people, of any culture. It's also interesting to note that in many Native communities, when someone needs aid, the village or the tribe or the clan or whatever social group is appropriate bands together and provides that aid. It's actually considered rude in many Native cultures to be forced to ask for aid, and demeaning, in fact. So being in a position of needing to ask for aid when this is not a culturally appropriate action means that many Native communities are hesitant to ask for that aid until it is a more dire circumstance. This is a simple change that can be made on the part of state agencies, which would put Native people in a much more comfortable position of accepting an aid that is rightfully theirs as citizens of the state and of the nation, but does not put them in a position of violating their own cultural practices. Additionally, Stransky discusses that one of the aspects of being seen as dependent for aid comes from the fact that some Native communities exist in more disaster-prone areas. But this is more a function of the land that was available under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, rather than a choice by those tribes to purposefully live in that location. Many of these disaster-prone areas are not traditionally inhabited, or at least not traditionally inhabited year-round. They might have served a seasonal function in the past, but because that is where the community was allowed to be, that is now the circumstance that the community must deal with. Another aspect of damage from colonialism is the loss of language. Many indigenous languages around the world are being threatened, and in particular, many in North America are at risk of being lost within the next century. Language can be an incredibly crucial part of cultural identity, as it can be tied not only to beliefs and practices, stories that are handed down generation to generation, art, and other modalities of cultural expression. But it can be difficult to secure funding or to coordinate efforts to preserve languages, especially in Alaska, because many communities that speak particular languages are geographically separated from each other by great distances, and that account for relatively small populations. Hens and Davis discuss the case of Hawaii, where the preservation of the language across the state is a more simple matter because there is a dominant indigenous language that is spoken throughout the archipelago. In Alaska, however, with many different languages spread distant from each other, this makes coordinating and finding resources much more complicated. In many areas, small communities have needed to find funding on their own, which could otherwise be spent on many other aspects necessary to preserving the community. This is one aspect where a majority culture can assist by providing that funding or other tools that are necessary, but should not take over the act of preserving the language. Finally, as discussed by Tuck, the damages of colonialism, which have been ongoing for many years, centuries in fact, means that many Native communities identify themselves as broken or do not see themselves as whole. The internalized damage caused by colonialism can take a drastic psychological toll on people. Tuck discusses, in fact, the Clark-Doll test, which was administered to young African American children during the Civil Rights Movement. And many African American children would identify the white dolls rather than the black dolls as good or pretty, and would identify the dolls that looked more like themselves as bad or ugly. This shows that internalizing the idea of being broken or not whole is something that can set in childhood and carry through with someone throughout their life. Tuck suggests creating a culture based on hope instead of one based on being broken. Tuck discusses, however, that this is necessarily something that must come from within the Native community, that research driven by Native interests with the tone of hope, not to diminish or to ignore the damages of colonialism, but to overcome and surpass them instead. The necessity of this being originated within the Native community is part of healing that damage, part of healing a people that can sometimes view themselves as not being whole. I personally believe that this is necessary, but that it is the rightful duty of the majority culture to assist in any way that is asked for, and to provide resources when necessary to assist, because this colonial damage was perpetuated by the majority culture. This colonial damage continues at times by the majority culture. And the majority culture must play a supporting role in undoing some of that damage and overcoming it. Thank you.